It's Monday, September 24th, 1984. I'd gotten home from school, gone into the back of the house, and was watching television. It was 5:03 in the afternoon when my mother called and said, "See if your brother's going to have supper with us." He'd been homesick from school that day, and when I got home from school, his bedroom door was closed, and I presumed that he was sleeping. So I got up, and I went to his bedroom door, and as I began to open it, realized he had blocked the door. He'd pushed his desk up against the door so that it couldn't be opened. And like big brothers do, I just put my shoulder against it and pressed until I could push it open. And when I got in the room, it was the most horrible thing that I could imagine. My brother had shot and killed himself with a .38 caliber pistol. And I really didn't know what to do, and I called out, and my mother came in the room, and that didn't make things better. She turned the lights on, and that made it worse. I went to find my dad. He was at the church, so I called the church to tell them. Someone had to go and tell him, and then drive him home. And by the time he was home, people were gathering around outside. Paramedics had come. Friends were coming. It was 2 days of absolute numbness and shock and grief. And then we went out to the cemetery together. Where I'm from in West Texas, a long procession of cars will drive and everyone turns their headlights on to signal that they're in the funeral procession. Where I'm from in West Texas, cars on the other side of the street stop and turn their lights on to show their respect and their condolences. We went out to the cemetery, the 6 of us, surrounded by family and friends, and we came back, the 5 of us. And what I wanted more than I wanted anything in all the world was for my brother to get out of that ground and come back home with us. But there is a finality to death. And that's the way that it is. That was my introduction to it. It's not unique to me. From November to April of this year, this congregation had 24 funerals. That averages about 1 a week over that period of time. But we didn't spread them that way. There were a couple of weeks where we had 3 funerals a week. Each one of those is emotionally draining for the family that's involved, for entire Sunday school classes. Time and again, we went to the cemetery to put into the ground and lay to rest the body of someone we love. Time and again, we gathered together to pray together, to cry together, to laugh together, to remember together. Time and again, we gathered together to grieve, but not as those without hope. What does that mean? To grieve, but not as those without hope. The prose comes from Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. The promise comes to us from Jesus himself, and the power of that is at the very center of Christian faith. And the question today is, how do we have hope in the face of death? To get at that, we're going to look at the story of 2 sisters. Their names are Martha and Mary, and something that happened between them and Jesus a long time ago. Martha and Mary had a brother. His name was Lazarus, and he was sick, and he was growing weaker and weaker and sicker, and all 3 of them, Martha and Mary and Lazarus, they were close to Jesus. And they came to know that Jesus was close to them, and so they sent someone out to find Jesus where he was and bring him back, believing that if Jesus were here, things would be different. You know, and I know, because we've read John's Gospel, when the word came to Jesus, he stopped and he waited. Martha and Mary don't know that. What they know is that by the time Jesus got to Bethany, a little town just 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, their brother was dead. And he'd already been in the tomb for 4 days. In that culture, you bury somebody within 24 hours of their death, ideally on the very day that they die. And that burial inaugurates a week-long period of mourning where friends and family would come and stand outside the tomb at the cemetery and weep and wail. There was a belief in Judaism that the spirit lingered over the body for about 3 days and then departed. So on the 4th day, there is absolutely no hope. On the 4th day, it's not mostly dead, it is all the way dead, and there's nothing to be done about that anymore. Jesus arrives on that 4th day, and Jesus and Mary and Martha go out to the tomb together, and there it is, this cave with a stone that has been rolled in front of it. And Jesus knows something about tombs with stones that need to be rolled away. In fact, it's fair to say that Jesus meets Martha and Mary not on their way to a tomb, but on their way to 2 tombs. Jesus knows if he's going to call Lazarus out of this tomb, Jesus himself is going to have to go into his own tomb. And there they go, and they stand among the mourners who are weeping and wailing, and the scripture says Jesus wept. And then in a loud voice, he called out, "Lazarus, come forth!" And he did. Right in the middle of that, there's an exchange between Martha and Jesus that has the power to change our lives forever and to help us see the hope that we have in the face of death. It's in John's Gospel in the 11th chapter. If you have a copy of the scripture, would you open it there? To John chapter 11. We're going to begin in verse 20. John chapter 11, beginning in verse 20. And there the scripture says, "When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed back inside in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And even still, I believe that God will give you whatever you ask him.' And Jesus said, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha responded, 'I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day.' And Jesus said, 'I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die.' Do you believe that?" Martha said, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is to come into the world." This is the word of the Lord. All Martha knows is Jesus is coming to town, and all she knows to do when he gets there is to come to him and say, "If only you had been here." We've all said that sometime, haven't we? When was the last time you said it? If only I had been here or there. If only she hadn't done this. If only he had done that. If only I had recognized the signs or heard the cries, it would be different. We all face them. And when we come into those moments, we know the horrible helplessness of wanting to turn back the clock and not being able to do so. It's a fantasy we all have. It's a fantasy the world plays on. The Back to the Future movie series made a fortune on this idea. What if we could just go back to the past, days or years or generations back, and fix something that was wrong back there, so when we get back to here, it would be different and better and right? It is a nostalgia, not for a past that was, but for a present that might have been. If only the past had been different. And like all nostalgia, it calls us to consider what might have been, even while reminding us that the present is wholly different than that. The way that it is not the way that we want it to be. It's a fantasy to engage in that. And fantasy is a wonderful escape to a different place, but hope does not make its home in a fantasy. We can wish for a different past, but there is no present hope in that. Hope makes its home in faith. Faith is not our power over God. Faith is not the way we think if we believe hard enough, pray long enough, act deep enough, that somehow God will come and change the past and make the present different. That's not what faith is. Faith is our openness to what God might yet do in this real and present moment. Faith is our trust that God works and wills for the good of the whole world and for our good too. And though we cannot yet see how, God's active here. Faith is our enduring belief that because God is for us, life will win, even when we don't understand how. Jesus said to Martha, "Your brother will rise again." That idea that there's a resurrection at the end of time, that is stock Jewish belief. That didn't come into the world with Jesus. That's what Jews in the first century knew about the world. There were some sects like the Sadducees who did not believe that, but on the whole, Jews believed there was a resurrection coming at the end of time. Somewhere out there, a long way off, at the very end of things, God was going to put the world to right. The prophets said it. If you tend to Isaiah and Daniel, you get a word from them that there is coming a new heaven and a new earth. A second chance for God's whole creation through God's redeeming power, where a place where the beauty of the world will be enhanced and pain and grief will be taken away. And in that new world, people will be given new bodies to live long and full and rich and graceful lives. I know we'll be raised on the resurrection on the last day, Martha said. Martha believes that there is more to this life than we live in our days. That there's something beyond the grave. Not everybody believes that. Some people try to live their lives believing that the number of days we have here is all we have. There's no such thing as the future. That our life is sort of a vital interlude between not being and not being. That someday death is going to come and swallow us up, and that's the end of everything you've ever known. There's a famous tombstone that was found in Rome, and the inscription on the stone reads, "I was not, I was, I am not again." There's no hope in that. There's only despair if that's the way we live our lives. But Martha's not one of those people who believes the future has been cut off from us. She's one of those people who believe in the doctrine of the resurrection on the last day. And the doctrine of the resurrection on the last day says this life is not all there is. That God's desire for us and God's plan for us and God's intention for us is more than our 70. That birth really is a clue. That letting go of one life is embracing another, fuller, richer life. Like a seed, when you drop it in the ground and it looks all shriveled up and dead. And then water finds its way to it and its roots come out and its stalks go up and its branches make way. Like the oak is to the acorn, is new life to the old life. That this life we're living is just one chapter in the great story that God is writing. Martha believes that doctrine of the resurrection on the last day. And doctrine is not very comforting when you are standing beside the grave of your brother. All you want is for the hurt to go away here and now. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. And he who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. This is the moment where the curtains pull back and Jesus tells us the whole reason that he's come. This is the moment where we get a sense of the vocation that has brought Jesus into the world. I represent in my person God in the flesh. I represent in my person the love of God that is stronger than death and larger than life and here present to you. And if a person believes in me, that person will never know the nothingness that is death. This future resurrection that is out there somewhere has collapsed itself back into time. This hope that we have longed for, that Israel waits for, has made itself present to Martha in the person of Jesus, and he is standing beside her at the graveside. The resurrection is not a doctrine. The concept of resurrection becomes a doctrine over time. This is how we get doctrine. Something happens in the life of some person, and after the fact, they think about it, and pray about it, and talk about it, and discern around it. And when they come to realize that this thing that's happened matters not just in my lives, but in other people's lives too, we try to find ways to describe it, and that description becomes what we call doctrine. The resurrection is not a doctrine. The resurrection is first a person, and his name is Jesus. And Jesus comes to us in the very midst, in the very events of our lives, here and now, not there and then. And he's standing before Martha, there in the cemetery, inviting her to take this huge leap of faith and trust. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is to come into the world. That makes all the difference. Because if Jesus really is the Christ, if he is the Messiah, if he is the Emmanuel, the God with us, if he is life in person, if he is the resurrection walking around, then the grave cannot prevail against him. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord. And Martha believed him just on his words, just when he said it. She could not possibly know everything she was confessing, but she was looking at everything she knew about Jesus, and she trusted herself to him. Jesus, everything I know about you says that's who you are, and that's enough for me. And sure enough, that is enough for her. His presence in her grief led her to this trust and belief and faith. You and I, we have an advantage that Martha did not have. We know. Because we know the rest of the story. We know Jesus was raised from the dead. The grave did not, could not, cannot, does not hold our Jesus. And because Jesus holds us, the grave cannot hold us either. And because Jesus holds all of those who love him, the grave cannot hold them either. And what that means at the most personal level is I may not get to walk out of the cemetery with my brother, but I live my life under the promise that I will see him again alive. And I will live with him forever on the other side of the grave. Because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And whoever believes in him, even though they die, yet shall they live. Believe it. Stake your life on it. Trust everyone you know to it. Tell everyone who will listen about it. And you will never regret it. Well,